Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
The final exercise in this procedure would be to re-wax or develop the occlusion on the three teeth that we've reduced. We'd want to develop the occlusion on the molar, the canine, and the central incisor. In the waxing procedure, the highest elevations, the cusps, and the deepest depressions, the fossae, are developed first. Supporting cusps and centric stops are the only parts to touch in centric. The various combinations of the tooth contacts and tooth forms that occur naturally cannot be covered in this handout. Each one of you have your own set of casts mounted on the articulator. Therefore, only average tooth contacts and tooth forms are represented in the drawings in the handout. With the knowledge of dental anatomy and function, each situation should be evaluated to determine the best combination of form and function for a specific case. Incidentally, if you have teeth that are not present or the teeth are not in contact, have one of the instructors check it. If we can't find adequate teeth to wax on your own casts, you will be given a set of ideal casts to do the waxing. In waxing occlusion to mandibular movements, as I said before, the occlusal morphology is determined somewhat by movements, and those parts not involved in function are waxed to arbitrary tooth form. Therefore, a knowledge of your past dental anatomy is essential in waxing this procedure. The first step in the waxing procedure is to locate the centric stop on the opposing or the existing occlusion. If we refer to the drawing in the handout, we have several possibilities for centric stops. One of the first is a centric stop in a fossa area. As you see here, we would have the supporting cusp coming to rest in a fossa area. The next option would be a cusp to a single marginal ridge, and this we would have represented here, the supporting cusp coming down to a single marginal ridge. Next possibility would be a cusp to an embrasure. And here we would have a cusp coming down to contact two marginal ridges, or a cusp to an embrasure. Again, the centric stop should be near escape ways so that in the movements, the supporting cusp that we develop has a chance to move in the functional movements and not interfere with the existing cusps that are present. In a waxing to existing occlusion, you cannot change the centric stops or the positions of the opposing cusps too much. We have to more or less design our occlusion to fit what is there. Now on the casts, on the upper and lower, or the maxillary and mandibular teeth, we would like you to locate the proposed centric stops for the existing occlusion. If we had a stop in the fossa area here, we would want to mark it, and then this would be the path of movement of that opposing supporting cusp that we're going to develop in the working movement, and this would be the direction of movement in the balancing movement. And of course, this would be the direction of that cusp in the protrusive movement. Now, not all of the fossa areas of the teeth are usable centric stops. If we were to put a centric stop in the mesial fossa of this molar, we would note that the balancing movement would move directly over and you'd have an interference with this cusp. You would create a balancing interferences. So generally the distal fossa areas of the lower teeth provide suitable centric stops, and on the maxillary teeth, the mesial fossa area are ideal centric stop areas. So we'd like you to take your casts, and on the maxillary and the mandibular teeth, draw the directions of movements of the supporting cusps on the teeth as you move the articulator from side to side. If we look at this from a different angle, imagine that you're in the throat looking at the lingual surfaces of the teeth. We again have our paths of movement. Now these paths of movement represent the way the maxillary supporting cusps move in relationship to the mandibular occlusal surface. As you can see, the supporting cusp, there's the balancing, the working. This is the balancing movement. These are the paths that the supporting cusps take in their movements around the condyles. Step 2 is the development of the supporting cusp tips. The supporting cusps are the buccal cusps of the maxillary posterior teeth, the buccal cusps of the mandibular posterior teeth, and the anterior or incisal edges of the lower anterior teeth. To aid in the location of our supporting cusp, we would want to direct the supporting cusp towards the centric stop that we've already marked. So with the articulator closed, opening and closing the articulator, this is the stop or the mark that we want to direct our cusp toward. So we close the articulator, mark on the side of the tooth where we would like to develop this cusp. And the distal cusp would develop in this area. Now we can open the articulator and the two marks that we have here are the areas that we would want to start to develop our supporting cusps. Referring back to the handout again, we would have our supporting cusp. We're going to develop this cusp cone, and really the cusp cone, the only thing we want to establish is the tip of the cusp and where it contacts the opposing occlusal surface. So we'll develop the two supporting cusps. There are no supporting cusps on the anterior teeth, so in this step we do not develop any of the anterior tooth parts. So with our waxing instrument, number 1 waxing instrument, the small tip, we build our cusp cone the way that we did on our thumbnail on the area that will direct it toward the centric stop that we located on the opposing tooth. Want to tease the cusp cone up to a point like we did on our cone that we developed on the fingernail. When we have the cusp build up to sufficient height to where we think we have contact, we would go ahead with our zinc stearate, take a little zinc stearate on the brush, dust it on the cusp cone, close the articulator into occlusion, and the first thing we'd want to check is to see if we have contact. And as you can see right on the tip of that cusp, you can see a little burnish spot where we have contact, see? The dull area was where we put the zinc stearate. The little shiny area means that we have contact with that supporting, or the centric stop. Now what we want to determine is whether we have that cusp pad positioned so that it'll move between the cusps on the opposing teeth. We would have to move the cusp buccolingually to get it in the center of the opposing tooth, or mesial-distally to get it where it would move between the opposing cusps. So we close the articulator now and go through the working and balancing and protrusive movements. We developed our supporting cusp down towards the centric stop that we've located. And now we see we can move the supporting cusp in the balancing movement and not have contact, or in the working movement and not have contact. To save time, we go ahead and develop the supporting cusp off camera. You can see here we've developed the distal lingual supporting cusp. We have the mesial lingual supporting cusp. You note that we have contacts established here. We dusted this with zinc stearate and picked up our contacts. This contact we developed on a embrasure where we have two contacts, one on each marginal ridge. The importance of establishing the supporting cusps at this time is essential. If the supporting cusps are not located in the proper positions, none of the other parts of the tooth will be developed. So if we close the articulator now and observe the way the cusps move in relationship to the opposing occlusal surfaces. We move in a balancing and a working movement. Now, in a balancing movement, the supporting cusp should not contact. We should have clearance created, or we have paths of movement for these cusps to move where they do not have to contact. This is in a balancing movement. In the working movement, the supporting cusps do not contact the lingual cusps or non-supporting cusps of the lower teeth. This is the working movement. In a protrusive movement, the developed supporting cusp will move down the central groove of the opposing occlusal surface and should not have to contact. If the cusps contact in any one of these movements and you wanted to change it, you would remelt and reform the supporting cusp so that it would meet this functional criteria. Step 3, we develop the centric stop for the opposing supporting cusp. Again, referring back to the handout, we would have a lower supporting cusp resting in the central fossa area of this maxillary molar. We will also eventually have a contact develop on the distal marginal ridge. In this step, all we do is form the fossa contacts. Those contacts that will develop on the marginal ridges will be developed at a later time. Now, if we look at the anterior teeth and the way they come into contact, if it looks like the contact is going to develop on the marginal ridges, then we would wait and develop those at a later stage. Here is the centric stop. We would like to build a wax down to where it contacts the cusp tip of the opposing supporting cusp. So we now look at the articulator and way the teeth come together. This is the supporting cusp, lower supporting cusp, that is going to contact in the central fossa area of the maxillary first molar. And this is the centric stop that we would like to develop. We see that that centric stop is going to contact in this area. See, this supporting cusp is going to contact the central fossa area. So we mark that area. And the area that we want to add our wax for our centric stop is there. Using the small end of our waxing instrument, again, number 1 waxing instrument, we add wax to that area. Now, if you note, when you're adding wax, use your fingers as a support. You can try to add wax without supporting, you shake all over the place, especially if you've had a bad night before. So support your fingers, add the wax. Now, the wax wasn't warm enough, it wouldn't leave the instrument, so we rewarm it until it leaves the instrument. We add a couple of drops of wax, estimating how high the centric stop will be. Now, I had that one too warm, and it flows all over the place. When we think we've added enough wax, we dust the surface with a zinc stearate, and we close the articulator to see if we've established a contact. Tapping the articulator in Centric, the first thing we want to do is establish a contact with that opposing cusp tip. As you see here, we have no burnished mark, so we haven't established contact as yet. So we'll add a little bit more wax. Now, if the wax is too hot, if you just hold the instrument a minute and let it chill, and it won't flow all over. We add a drop of wax. As the wax chills, we add our zinc stearate. We close the articulator, tap it in Centric to see if we've got contact. Now, with the addition of that drop of wax, you can see here we have contact. See the little burnished area that we have here? We now have our contact established with our supporting cusp tip. Now, the paths of movement of that supporting cusp, again, is important. So we want to now move the articulator in lateral movements. We said the lateral movements help to establish the anatomical form of the parts. So we move this in a working and a balancing movement and a protrusive movement. We see that the cusp tip is contacting the centric stop. Now, as I said, at this time we will not develop the centric stops on the anterior teeth. These centric stops, as we close the articulator again and look at the way the anterior teeth contact, we see that this contact is going to be established on the mesial marginal ridge, this contact on the distal marginal ridge. So we won't establish those contacts at this time. Also, notice on the central incisor that the contacts will be established on the marginal ridges there rather than the cingulum area. Now, if we refer back to our handout, we have several options of where we would have centric stops on our anterior teeth. As you can see here in this drawing, the most ideal place probably for an anterior centric stop would be in this concave cingulum area of the anterior tooth. We notice on the case that we have here on the articulator that contact is going to be established in the area along the marginal ridge. It's going to be incisal to the central or the cingulum area. If this is going to occur, then we could, in order to transfer the forces along the long axis of the tooth, create a little flat area on the marginal ridge for the opposing centric stop. If we established a contact on an incline or on the lingual curvature of the tooth, then we could wind up with a resultant lateral force on the tooth. In step 4, we develop the non-supporting cusp tips. The non-supporting cusps are the buccal cusps of the maxillary posterior teeth, the incisal edges of your maxillary anterior teeth, and the lingual cusps of the lower posterior teeth. In the first part, we will develop the non-supporting cusp for the molar. The two cusp cones will develop at this time. The position of the cusp cone will be to go between the two opposing supporting cusps. The length or the height of these cusps will be determined by the movements of the articulator. So here the height determines the movements determine the height of the cusp and also the position of the cusp. Now we try to determine the functional position of where we want the supporting cusps. As you can see here, we would like this non-supporting cusp to go between the two mandibular supporting cusps. So we will mark that cusp so that we can go right between those two lower supporting cusps. That's where we would like that cusp cone to be developed. The distal buccal cusp cone we would want to go between these two supporting cusps, so we would mark that so that it'll move between the two cusps on the opposing arch. We now add wax and develop the cusp cone for the non-supporting cusps. Now these cusp cones will develop more towards the outside or the outer edge of the occlusal surface. I'll point out in a minute the difference between the supporting cusps and the non-supporting cusp. The non-supporting cusps do not contact in centric. The only parts that contact in centric are the supporting cusps and the centric stops. The non-supporting cusps do not contact in centric. When we build it up in sufficient height to where we think we're ready to check the movements, we would dust a little zinc stearate. Now I'm blowing this off with my mouth. This is a poor procedure, but we don't have any air in the filming. You should not blow in the mouth, as obvious. Now we close the articulator, go through our functional movements, and the movements will determine the position of that cusp and also the height of the cusp. Now in our working movement, we have several cusps in contact on the working side. We could build this cusp into contact at this time. We also note that it passes between the two opposing supporting cusps so that they don't clash. Of course, in balancing movement, this cusp does not come into play. In protrusive movement, you would want to have a little bit of overjet on the posterior teeth. The cusps extend buccally to the lower buccal cusps, so you'd have a little bit of room in your protrusive movement. You would have a certain amount of overjet on the buccal cusps. Now we'll cut the camera and develop the other supporting cusp at this time off camera. We went ahead and developed the distal buccal non-supporting cusp. We developed this over the line that we drew on the buccal surface to show us where we'd like the tip of that cusp to be. Now you note here and again that we are just developing the tip of the cusp. This is the important part here. The actual shape of the rest of the cusp will be developed when we establish our cusp ridges and marginal ridges. Now that we have those developed the way we think they should be, we go ahead and dust this with our zinc stearate, close the articulator, and make sure they function the way that they should. So in a working movement, we would like the non-supporting cusp to move between the opposing supporting cusps. In the working movement, these cusps do not necessarily contact. They can be developed into contact and provide guidance for this working movement if other posterior teeth are in contact. Of course, in the balancing movement, there is no contact, and in the protrusive movement, there is no contact. Now, there are certain differences between the non-supporting cusp and the supporting cusp that I'd like to point out at this time. If you will note the position of the cusp cones in relationship to the occlusal surface. Note that the supporting cusps are nearer the center of the tooth than the non-supporting cusps. The non-supporting cusps are out near the outer edges of the occlusal surface. This is so we can get the supporting cusps near the central fossa on the opposing tooth. The non-supporting cusps do not contact in centric, so they are out on the outer edges of the occlusal surface of the teeth so that they will be out of the road, and this establishes a little bit of overjet or overlap of these cusps with the lower teeth. You'll note also that the non-supporting cusps are sharper and smaller cusps, whereas your supporting cusps are bigger, broader, flatter cusps. If you will note the height position of the supporting cusp, you will note that the supporting cusp is longer. It has to be longer in order to contact in centric. We don't want the non-supporting cusp to contact, so it will be shorter in the functional movements. One of the reasons that the supporting cusp can be longer is that in the balancing movement, the condyle moves up an incline, whereas in the working movement, for the working cusp, the working condyle rotates rather than moves up an incline. So the non-supporting cusps are shorter than the supporting cusps. And this establishes a buccal-lingual curve of Wilson of our teeth. If you'll notice all of the teeth, there is a curve buccal-lingually as well as anterior-posteriorly. Now, the curve that is established by the tips of the cusps in an anterior-posterior direction is our curve of Spee. And this is established by the cusp tips. The cusp tip of the second molar, the supporting cusp tip of the second molar is shorter than the first molar. The bicuspids are shorter. This gives us our anterior curvature of anterior curve of Spee. This is one of our determinants of our occlusion. Having developed the non-supporting cusps on the posterior teeth, we then go and establish our supporting cusp on our canine. Again, we look at the functional movements and we decide where would be the best place to establish this cusp tip. We would want the cusp to move between these two cusp tips in a lateral movement. So the best place to establish our cusp tip would be right here. So that when it moved laterally, it would move between the two cusp tips rather than clash. So now we will add the non-supporting cusp to the canine. We build our cusp cone near the area that we marked. When we add the wax to a sufficient height, to check to see whether it's high enough, we dust it with the zinc stearate, close the articulator, and go into our lateral movements. Now the canine is a tooth that can be developed into contact in our working movement to help guide the teeth or separate the teeth on the balancing side. So we can carve this or wax this cusp tip to where we have a definite contact or guidance from this non-supporting cusp. As you see here, we are developing a burnished area or an area of contact as we go into lateral movement. We'll add a little more wax to pick up more of a positive contact. As it chills, we will dust it with the zinc stearate. Close the articulator and go through our lateral movements. Now we'll develop the rest of that cusp off camera. We will now move on to develop the incisal edge of the central incisor or our non-supporting cusp on the central incisor. This we will build this edge, the incisal edge of the central incisor. The height of it will be determined by the protrusive movement. As you see here, there's a space between the incisal edge and the lower incisor. This one contacts the lower incisor. So we will build the wax down until it contacts the lower incisor. The height of the cusp is determined by the functional movements. Now we finished up the waxing of the non-supporting cusp for the central incisor. When we got it to sufficient height, we dusted it with the zinc stearate. The height of this cusp is determined by the protrusive movement. In a protrusive movement, the anterior teeth contact these supporting cusps, or non-supporting cusps rather, provide the guidance which separate the posterior teeth. So the anterior teeth contact in protrusive, and the posterior teeth are not supposed to contact in protrusive. So the height of this non-supporting cusp is determined by the protrusive movement. So we build it down until it contacts in the protrusive movement. The lateral movement, the teeth do not contact. The posterior or the anterior teeth may contact, but the main guidance is picked up from the canine and the several other teeth. In step 5, develop the cusps and marginal ridges and also the axial caval surface contours. If you refer to the handout again, we develop the cusp ridges, which go into the marginal ridges, cusp ridges, and on around the circumference of the tooth. Also, we develop at the same time the axial contours, which extend from these marginal ridges that we've developed, or these ridges we've developed, down towards the gingival tissue, or they blend in with the curvatures of the teeth. On the anterior teeth, on the canine, we have a distal marginal ridge, we have our mesial marginal ridge, and also a central ridge. On the central incisor, we have a distal marginal ridge and a medial marginal ridge. Now, if you'll note, we will also probably develop some centric contacts or centric stops on these marginal ridges, probably in these two areas, maybe on the mesial of the canine or mesial marginal ridge, and then if we go back to the molar, we may either have one on the mesial marginal ridge or the distal marginal ridge of the molar. So we add drops of wax to form these marginal ridges. Be sure not to change the position of the cusp. They extend from the cusp tip, but the cusp tip, we've established contact and we'd like to stay the same. We are now developing the distal marginal ridge. Now, when we've added a sufficient amount of wax to establish the contact, we'll go ahead and dust it with a zinc stearate. And then we'll close the articulator and go through our movements to determine whether we have a contact or not. We go through the balancing and the working movements and the protrusive movement. And then we check our wax. And as we can see here, we did establish a contact. We can see the little burnished mark. See the little burnished mark that we've established here. So this is developed high enough so that we establish a centric contact, and then the rest of the marginal ridge is out of the road. So we continue to add wax on around the occlusal surface of the teeth and establish our cusp ridges Now we don't want to build these cusp ridges up too high because there will be a cusp moving between those ridges. The opposing supporting cusp will move through those ridges. So whether you add a segment of the ridge, go through the movements to determine whether you've got contact or not. In this way, we're using the functional movements to determine the anatomical parts. As you see here, this lower cusp wants to go between these two cusps, so we want a deep groove going between the two cusps. Now we'll cut here and go ahead and develop the rest of the marginal ridges on the off camera. We have now developed the cusp and the marginal ridges around the circumference of the occlusal surface of the teeth. If you'll note here, on the distal marginal ridge, we established a centric stop for the lower supporting cusp. We also established a contour, a cusp bridge for each of the cusp tips. On the mesial marginal ridge, you note here again that we've established a centric stop for the lower supporting cusp. Also, on the cusp ridges here, we've established a contact. The marginal ridges and cusp ridges can serve as centric stops and also can serve as guide planes for the working movement. As we go through the working movement, we were going to have some contact on this cusp ridge. This provides guidance for the working movement. Now that we've formed the marginal ridges and the cusp ridges, we can go ahead and form the axial or cable surface contours. They would extend from your cusp ridges and marginal ridges down to blend in with the remainder of the tooth. So we would add wax to this area. This is one of the very few places that you would ever have to carve the wax. And these surfaces are generally relatively flat areas, so with the carver, fiber-handled carver, you would carve this surface to blend in with the cusp and the marginal ridges and the axial contours of the tooth, so that you'd have a nice blending of these surfaces. Now on the lingual surface, when you add this wax, be sure to check this in functional movements to determine whether you built the wax up too much. These areas could interfere with the lower or mandibular non-supporting cusps. Now we move on to the anterior teeth. We'd establish the marginal ridge on the canine, the cusp ridge extending from the cusp tip, the marginal ridge extending on around the circumference of the tooth. Remembering that we can form contacts on these marginal ridges. When the marginal ridge is at certain thickness or height, add the zinc stearate. Close the articulator and go through the movements to determine whether you have contact or not. The height of the marginal ridge is determined by the functional movements. Now, if there was so much space between the teeth on the models that you have mounted, if there was a large space between the lingual surfaces of the upper teeth and the incisal edges of the lower teeth, you would not build it out into contact, but you'd use the adjacent tooth to determine the ridge height and the contours. The ridge height of the two adjacent teeth should be somewhat the same. So we could go ahead and add the marginal ridges on the central incisor the same way. These would extend around the circumference of the tooth. And the wax is of sufficient thickness. Redust it. Close it down into contact. Go through the movements, protrusive movements, and the working and balancing. These movements will determine the height of these ridges. You can see here we've established a little bit of a contact on this marginal ridge. Now to save time, we'll go ahead and develop the rest of the marginal ridges on the anterior teeth off camera. We now have the marginal ridges developed, and we note here that we have both contact and guidance established on our marginal and cusp ridge. Here we have a contact, centric contact, established here. On this part of the marginal ridge, we have a centric stop and also a guiding incline. This is a guiding incline for the working movement. So we have centric stops and we also have guiding inclines. On the central, we have the same thing here. We have our centric stops, the two centric stops here. These occur not in the cingulum area, but up along the marginal ridges. You'll see little relatively flat areas at this point. Then when the patient goes into protrusive, you will see this guidance which separates the posterior teeth. And the anterior teeth are used to separate the posterior teeth. So we have contacts, centric contacts, and also our guidances. Now that we've added our marginal ridge, we can go ahead and complete our axial contours on the anterior teeth. We would add wax to this area so that we can blend the cusp and marginal ridge, or cusp and cusp ridge, in with the axial contours. We would add a wax, and then using the carver, we would blend this surface in with the axial contour. And on the central, we would do the same thing. We'd add wax to this area. Make sure that we don't have or don't disturb the cusp height to that cusp. The height of that cusp is determined by the protrusive movement. After adding a certain amount of wax or an excess of wax, we go ahead and use our carver to establish the contour of our cavo surface or axial surface. In step 6, develop the triangular ridges, the grooves, and the remaining tooth form. Referring back to the handout, the triangular ridges extend from the cusp tips towards the central groove or the developmental groove. They're narrow at the top, wide at the bottom, and this gives them their triangular appearance. Remember, too, that the triangular ridges must parallel the paths of movement. This gives us our ridge direction. So the lingual triangular ridges on the maxillary posterior teeth would be oblique and parallel to the path of movement of the balancing cusp. And on the buccal cusp, the triangular ridges of the buccal cusp would be more at right angles to the central part of the groove because of the more right angle working movement. So we will go ahead now and establish our triangular ridges. The height of the triangular ridge that we develop here is determined by the functional movements. So with the addition of each triangular ridge, make sure you check it in all the functional movements to determine whether it is an interference or in clearance. So the triangular ridges that we're going to develop come from the cusp tip down to the central groove. This is the area we're going to develop it. You must have this one triangular ridge at an angle because the cusp moves laterally on an oblique angle here. Now here is an area where you want to be careful with the flow of the wax. If you have it too hot, you're going to obliterate all of the previous waxing that you've done. When it's of sufficient height, as the wax chills, dust it with the zinc stearate, and we close the articulator, and we go through our functional movements to determine whether we have clearance or not. In the balancing movements, we don't want these ridges to contact. So we want clearance. We check the burnish mark that we have with our zinc stearate, and we notice here that we have a tremendous contact or interference with the movement, the balancing interference that we've created here. So we must lower the height of that triangular ridge. Decrease the height of that ridge. One of the ways to do it is to carve away the wax, using the stiff end of a bristle brush to get rid of the chips of wax. And to make that surface curved again, we warm the instrument and remelt that surface. Notice the angle that we're trying to develop, this ridge and groove direction. Be sure that you reestablish the cusp contact if the cusp is involved. We'd add our zinc stearate, close the articulator, and go through our balancing movement, our working movement, and our protrusive movement. Cusp ridges can provide interferences in the protrusive movement also. So the balancing movement and the protrusive movement are the main movements for the lingual cusps. And as you can see here now, we have eliminated a lot of the interference from this cusp. We go ahead and form the triangular ridges on the buccal cusps. We said that these would be more at right angles to the central groove because the working movement is more at right angles to the central groove. You notice these ridges are coming down in the vicinity of the centric stop that we've established, and these can interfere with the lateral movements. As the wax chills, we add our zinc stearate. We close the articulator. Go through our movements. Here, the movements that would affect the cusp, or the triangular ridge height of the buccal cusp, would be our protrusive movement and our working movement. This is the working movement where the buccal cusps come in contact with each other. Protrusive movement, we don't want to have any contact on the triangular ridge. And we check our wax to see whether we have the proper contour. As you can see here again, we built the wax up a little bit too high, so we'll carve that away and reshape that triangular ridge. Now we'll go ahead and form the rest of the triangular ridge on the molar off camera. Now we've completed the addition of our triangular ridges, developed our major grooves and our secondary grooves. Again, pointing out that the triangular ridges on the lingual surfaces of on the lingual cusp are at oblique angles to represent the paths of movement of the supporting cusp and the balancing movement. The triangular ridges on the buccal cusp are more at right angles to the long axis or the central groove because the working movement is more at right angles. So we would go ahead, add our triangular ridges, With our number 3 waxing instrument, with a point on there, we can use that to establish and accentuate our grooves. We can burnish our grooves. On each side of a triangular ridge is a supplemental groove, mesial-distal, triangular ridge, supplemental groove, developmental groove, and on down the line. Make sure that everything is formed properly and we related the function to the form. We again dust the pattern or the wax up with the zinc stearate, close the articulator, and go through all of the movements. In the balancing movement, we don't want to have any contact between the surfaces of the posterior teeth in balancing movement. So we have our ridge and groove direction. Notice how the lower supporting cusp moves out through the groove that we created on the lingual cusp of the upper supporting cusp. That's the balancing movement. In the working movement, the cusp move between the adjacent cusps or the opposing cusps. We can either have contact or clearance. The non-supporting cusp can be used as guiding surfaces in the working movement. In protrusive, the anterior teeth contact and the posterior teeth should separate. Now if we look at our wax pattern after we've gone through our functional movements, we should have certain characteristics. We would have our centric stops that we created originally. We have one centric stop here on the distal marginal ridge. We have the major centric stop in the central fossa area here. We have a little bit of contact on our triangular ridge. We should reduce that a little bit so that the contact is right in the bottom of the fossa. And then we have our third centric stop on the mesial marginal ridge. We would have guidances coming out on these cusp ridges, but then there would be no other contacts other than the cusp tips as they contact the opposing tooth. Now the anterior teeth, to finish those up, the parts that are remaining do not come into contact. These would be the central fossa areas of your anterior teeth. So we would just add wax to these areas and complete the wax up. Now remember, we've already established the highest parts on these teeth. So the parts that we would add here would be depressions rather than high parts. They would not be involved in functional movements. The parts that we talked about, some of the parts are developed from function. Other parts that are not involved in function are developed according to ideal anatomical form. Go ahead and finish the wax up now off camera. Reviewing the functional relationship of our waxing now after we've finished the anterior wax patterns. If we note over here, we have the completed anatomical form of the tooth. We have our contacts and guidance points on the central incisor. We complete the central fossa area, our grooves in our cingulum area, and also our contact and guidance points. If you want to polish the pattern after you get through with it, you can use a piece of cotton and just cool water and just go over the wax pattern and polish the surface. If the wax is melted and allowed to chill without rubbing it, it should be smooth. Now this completes the wax up of our 3 teeth. To review the steps in the waxing procedure and to provide you with a guide in the waxing procedure, these models will be available in the laboratory for you to look at and review the steps. First step that we went through was to prepare the model for waxing. This we cut down the occlusal surface of the molar, the canine, and the central incisor. Step one in the waxing procedure is to locate your centric stops on the opposing occlusal surfaces. This we have done and marked the arrows of the stops. The next step would be to develop our supporting cusps. The supporting cusps are the lingual cusps of the maxillary teeth, and we develop these in step 2. These are the highest elevations and must be developed first. The second step, we develop the centric stop, the fossa stop that we have here in the central area of the tooth. The next step is to develop the non-supporting cusps. The non-supporting cusps are the buccal cusps of the maxillary posterior teeth, also the tip of the canine and the incisal edge of the central incisor. The next step was to develop the cusp ridges and marginal ridges and complete our axial contour. The cusp ridges and marginal ridges extended around the circumference of the tooth. We picked up some centric stops on either one of the marginal ridges. The axial contours extend from the ridges down to the contours of the tooth. We had a mesial, a central, and a mesial marginal ridge on the maxillary canine, and a distal and a mesial marginal ridge on the central. The next step, we developed our triangular ridges. The triangular ridges extend from the cusp tip towards the central area. They are wider at the top, wider at the bottom, narrow at the top, giving the triangular appearance. Each cusp has a triangular ridge. The triangular ridge is developed along the paths of movements of the cusps. To complete the wax up, we go ahead and add those parts of the tooth that are not involved in function. We develop our developmental grooves and our supplemental grooves and add the remaining parts of the tooth, those parts that are not involved in function. To finish the wax up and to polish the wax up, use a pledget of cotton, which gives you a nice, smooth surface.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.